The wind screamed over the ridges of the Wyoming Territory, sharp and bitter as a knife pulled fresh from snow. Snowflakes, heavy and wet, swirled like smoke around the evergreens, smothering every sound except the crunch of something struggling through it. She stumbled again, knee-deep in drifts that clung to her skirt like dead hands, and fell forward into the white. For a moment she didn't move. The storm swallowed her like a grave. Eliza Whitlock lay there, belly rounded and firm beneath her torn wool coat, one hand clutching a frayed satchel, the other pressed to the frozen earth. Her lips moved, but no sound escaped. Her voice had run dry hours ago. Her breath steamed once, then faded. She was no longer sure if her eyes were open. Just dark. She thought of Sam, of his blood still warm on her hands, of the thunder of hoofbeats behind her, the way they'd screamed when they took everything from her but this unborn child and a stubborn spark of will. She didn't cry. There was no time for crying. A distant crunch echoed in the woods, steady as a metronome, boots moving through snow. She barely heard it. A shadow passed between trees, tall and broad-shouldered, wrapped in oilskin and fur. He walked like the storm didn't bother him, like he had already been through worse. The man stopped when he saw her, said nothing. John Carver stood over the body in the snow, eyes narrowed beneath a brim heavy with frost. He didn't speak right away, just looked, boots planted, jaw clenched tight beneath an untrimmed beard that matched the storm in color and temperament. The woman wasn't dead, not yet. He could see her fingers twitch. "Ma'am," he said, the word gruff and simple. She didn't answer. Her head lolled to the side. Her lips were blue. Carver exhaled slowly. He'd come out for rabbits, check a trapline, maybe find solitude in the white wilderness he called home. Instead, he found a woman halfway buried to death, round with child and alone. This wasn't part of the plan. Still, he knelt beside her and unhooked the satchel from her hand. It contained a folded shawl, a rusted locket, and a Bible wrapped in cloth. No weapons, no food, nothing of use but a name scratched inside the cover, Eliza Whitlock. "Lord," he muttered, but not in prayer. He slung his pack off and pulled a blanket free, wrapping it tight around her shaking body. Then, with a grunt and more strength than a man his age ought to have left, he lifted her into his arms. Her weight pressed heavy against his chest, and the child she carried felt like a second soul between them. John didn't look back, just turned north and started walking. 12 miles. That's what it would take to reach Old Harrow's outpost, a cabin abandoned, but dry, stocked just enough from the last time he'd passed through. In summer, it was an afternoon ride. In this blizzard, it was a death march, and he was doing it on foot, carrying the weight of 2 lives. Branches clawed at him as he moved through the pine wood, each gust of wind like a slap from some angry god. The snow deepened past his knees. His boots had long since turned stiff with cold. His breath came in bursts, but he kept going, jaw tight, eyes narrowed. He didn't ask who she was, didn't ask why she'd been alone. He knew the shape of pain, and this one was carved deep. The ring on her finger was dulled with frost, but the blood under her nails was fresh. He remembered that look, empty and still but clinging, like the last thread in a tear-soaked shirt. He'd seen it once before. The day he came home from the war to find his wife and daughter laid beneath a hickory cross, both claimed by fever while he was chasing someone else's cause. He'd screamed back then, cried until he tore his voice raw. That was the last time. Now he walked and didn't speak, just breathed and carried. Behind them, the woods were quiet, but too quiet. Carver stopped once, shifting her weight to his other arm. She stirred. Her voice was a whisper, cracked and lost in the wind. "Sam." He didn't answer. She whimpered, a hand pressed lightly against his chest, then faded back into unconsciousness. Her skin was hot now, the way a person burns up before they freeze. He had to get her warm. The sun sank behind the trees faster than he liked. Darkness slid across the snow like oil, muting the world into a cold silence. Every shadow seemed to shift. He kept moving. When he reached the ridge, he paused. The trail dipped hard, the slope buried in ice. At the bottom, a narrow creek shimmered faintly, its surface thinly frozen. He tested the slope with his boot. It crunched. Slick. God damn it, he muttered, then looked at her face. She looked like she'd already died 3 times and clawed her way back out of spite. He braced himself and slid down, boots catching on branches. At the bottom, the creek waited like a dare. He eyed it, looking for the thickest part of the ice. The water moved slow beneath the surface, black and dangerous. One wrong step, and she'd be gone. "Ma'am," he said again, not knowing what else to call her. Then he walked forward. The ice cracked underfoot. He adjusted her weight, lightening it on one side. Each step he took was calculated slow. The ice whined like an old hinge. Then it gave. Just beneath his right foot, the surface shattered, plunging his leg into the knee. Ice water flooded his boot, biting like fire. He grunted, teeth clenched, but he didn't fall. Kept her above the water, clutching her tighter. His body burned with effort as he reached the far bank. Snow waited for him like an old enemy. He collapsed to one knee and didn't move for a full minute. Then he stood. Again. Hours passed like ghosts. Time ceased to matter. Just the next step. And the next. At one point, the woman opened her eyes. They were glassy but focused. She looked at him like he wasn't real. "Why?" she said. He didn't answer. She tried again, voice slurred. "Why re you helpin' me?" He shifted her higher and said, "'Cause someone didn't help me. Once." She stared at him. Then her eyes closed again. By the time he saw the shape of the cabin ahead, black against the pale, he could barely feel his hands. His leg was stiff with half-frozen blood. His breath came in broken gasps. The door was barred with drifted snow. He kicked it twice before it gave way. Inside, it was colder than outside, but dry. He lowered her onto a straw mattress, pulled the oilskin off, and lit a lamp from the flint kit in his bag. The fire pit was cold stone, but the chopped wood was still stacked in the corner, dry under canvas. Within minutes, flames crackled. He boiled snow for water, then stripped off his coat and wrapped around her again. Her lips were moving. He leaned close. "Baby, the baby." He pressed a hand to her stomach. It shifted slightly beneath his palm. Still alive. "Hang on," he muttered. Outside, the wind howled louder, as if angry he'd taken her from it. He sat against the wall, knees drawn up, revolver in hand. Just in case. He hadn't seen anyone out there, but he'd felt them. You didn't live this long in the wild without listening to the way the trees held their breath. The fire cast shadows across her face. She looked younger now, or maybe just free of pain. He thought again about his wife and how he'd failed to save her. How he'd run from everyone since. Maybe he was too far gone for redemption. Maybe not. But tonight, he'd carried someone. Not for coin. Not for duty. Just because it was right. She stirred again. Opened her eyes. Looked at him for real this time. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded. "Ma'am." Nothing more. Nothing less. And outside, the storm raged on, but inside there's heat breath and the start of something neither of them could yet name. The wind had come by morning, but the cold remained, bitter and sharp. It was the kind of cold that settled into bones and made a man forget warmth had ever existed. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low. John Carver stirred it back to life with the last of the pine kindling, coaxing the flames until they crackled steady again. Light flickered across the small room, casting long shadows on the log walls, warming the frostbitten air by degrees. Eliza lay beneath the thick wool blankets, her breathing shallow but steady now. Her fever had broken sometime before dawn, beads of sweat glistening on her brow like dew. He'd stayed awake all night, feeding the fire, pressing snow-wet cloths to her forehead, listening to the wild outside and the silence within. She opened her eyes slowly. For a moment, her gaze was unfocused, drifting across the room like it didn't belong to her. Then it settled on him. "You're still here," she rasped. John nodded, crouching beside the fire. "Ain't much else I gotta be," he said. She tried to sit up, winced, and fell back. Her hands went to her belly, instinctively, protectively. "The baby?" "Still kicking," he said, not unkindly. She looked away, and silence stretched between them like a thread pulled too tight. "You saved my life," she said after a moment, her voice soft as the embers. He didn't answer right away, just tossed another log into the fire. Don't reckon I could have walked on by, he said finally. Storm like that, and you out there alone. I wasn't alone, she murmured. Not at first. He didn't press. He'd seen the kind of loss that carved a woman down to what he saw in her eyes. Grief so recent it still bled behind the silence. He had no desire to make her speak it before she was ready. Instead, he handed her a tin cup of warm water. She sipped, hands shaking. My name's Eliza Whitlock, she said, more certain now. He nodded once. Carver. Is that a first name or last? Doesn't much matter. She smiled faintly. Guess not. The fire crackled. Outside, a raven called once sharp and cold. He glanced at the window, his expression tightening. You think someone's out there? She asked. I saw a light last night, just for a second. Could have been nothing. Or it could have been the kind of men who don't leave things unfinished. Eliza's face went pale. They're following me, she said. The men who killed Sam. Carver's jaw worked, but he said nothing. We just left our homestead, headed east. A week out from Laramie, 3 men rode up to camp. Claimed they needed food. Sam gave them bread, coffee. Then they saw me. One of them said I looked like a rich man's wife. She swallowed hard. Her hands trembled again. Sam told them to leave. They didn't. Carver stared into the flames. He could hear it in her voice, every word edged with memory, raw and flinching. He didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. They shot him. Right in front of me. I ran. Didn't take nothing but the satchel. Didn't look back. Did you see their faces? One of them had a scar down his neck. Burn mark, maybe. Another wore a buffalo coat with red stitching. They all had rifles. Carver nodded slowly. He'd seen men like that, wolves in denim, carving a name from fear. You got somewhere to go? He asked. My sister, she said. Fort Bridger. She's a nurse. I was heading there before the baby came. He stood and began pacing the room, his limp faint but present. You can't walk 12 miles like that, he said, and I sure as hell can't carry you twice. She looked away, ashamed. I wasn't a skin you two. He stopped, turned toward her. Didn't say you were. They sat in silence again, the only sound the low crackle of pine and the occasional hiss of melting snow in the pot. He moved to the window, pulled back the curtain. The snow had stopped falling, but the world beyond was still white, silent, and far from safe. I got traps about half a mile west, he said. Could bring back meat. Firewood's low. Water, too. Cabin won't hold long if they come. If they're tracking you, they'll find us. Sooner or later. Then we go, she said. Today. You can't stand up. I don't have to, she said. Just don't leave me. He looked at her then, not at her sickness, not at her weakness, but at her spine, and what he saw was a woman broken, but not bowed. He'd carried her through a blizzard, but she was carrying something just as heavy. I won't, he said, quiet as a vow. He left before sunrise, rifle slung over his back, traps in mind, and every step telling him he should have stayed a ghost, that he had no business bleeding for strangers again. But her eyes had haunted him. They weren't her eyes, not really. They were his wife's, his daughter's, all the ones he hadn't saved. By the time he returned, he had 2 rabbits, half a satchel of wood, and blood on his sleeve. Nothing serious, just a branch that bit back. He set the meat down by the hearth and stoked the fire again. Eliza was sitting upright now, pale but stronger. She'd tidied her hair, braided it back, and even found the strength to smile. Thought, maybe you ran off, she said. He raised a brow. If I was the running kind, I'd never have picked you up in the first place. She laughed. It was a tired sound, but true. Over the next hour, they ate, shared a can of beans and rabbit stew, and for the first time, spoke like people rather than survivors. She told him about the homestead in Kansas, about teaching letters to neighbor children, about the way her husband carved wooden toys for a child that hadn't even been born yet. He listened without speaking, but every word she gave him was like a splinter pulled from a wound. Painful, but necessary. You lose someone too? She asked, voice soft. He didn't answer, just stared at the fire. She didn't press. That night, he sat at the window long after she slept, watching shadows move where there shouldn't be any. The forest had gone still again, too still. When the first branch snapped outside, he didn't startle. just rose slowly, rifle in hand. Another step. Crunch. He crossed the door, looked through the cracks. Nothing. Then, a shape darted past the window, fast and low. Not human. Too quick. He stepped outside, boots sinking into old snow, rifle raised. The silence stretched. Then he heard it, a growl, low and guttural. He turned just as the mountain lion lunged. They hit the ground hard, snow exploding around them. He rolled, jammed, the rifle upward fired. The crack echoed through the valley. The cat yowled, clawed once at his shoulder, then fled into the trees, bleeding and howling. He sat up slowly, breath wheezing, shoulder burning. The claw had torn through cloth and skin, but not deep. Inside the cabin, Eliza screamed his name. He stumbled back in, blood dripping from his arm. She was on her feet, somehow gripping the doorframe. When she saw him, her face twisted in something between relief and terror. "It's gone," he said, breath ragged. "Just a cat." She helped him sit, wrapped his arm with one of the linens from her bag. "You've bled for me twice now," she said. He shook his head. "It's just blood. Can't take it with you." That night they both slept. For a while, anyway. Morning came gray and sullen. He woke first, checked the traps again. Nothing. But his eyes kept scanning the tree-line. Too quiet. When he returned, she met him at the door. "There's something coming, isn't there?" she asked. He nodded. "Yeah." She looked down at her belly. "Then we best be ready." He set the rifle down, leaned against the wall, and studied her. "You ain't what I expected," he said. "Neither are you." He chuckled once, but there was no joy in it, just a tired kind of respect. "Eliza," he said, "you ever shot a revolver?" "No. You'll learn." They spent the day preparing, boiling snow for water, checking every latch, every shutter. He showed her how to load the Colt, how to hold it. She trembled at first, then steadied. "I won't let them take this," she whispered, hand over her belly. He believed her. That night, just before sleep, she looked at him across the firelight. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He stared into the flames. "Because once someone saved me when I didn't deserve it," he said, "and I never thanked her." She didn't speak, just reached across the space between them, placed her hand on his. The fire burned warm. But it was the quiet between them that gave the cold no room to grow. Snow fell again the following evening, lighter now, drifting in lazy spirals past the windows of the old trapper's cabin. Inside, the fire cast a steady orange glow, warming the walls and softening the edges of a place built for survival, not comfort. Eliza sat near the hearth, hunched slightly, a wool blanket around her shoulders, the revolver resting across her lap like an unfamiliar truth. Her eyes didn't leave the window. John Carver stood at the table, sharpening the edge of his hunting knife with the slow, careful rhythm of a man preparing for something inevitable. His wounded shoulder was stiff, wrapped tight, and throbbed with every breath. But he didn't mention it. The pain was just another thing to bear. They hadn't spoken much since the sun went down. Words had dried up. All that remained now was readiness, whatever form that would need to take. Then came the sound. A branch snapped outside, deliberate, closer than before. Eliza stiffened. Her grip tightened on the revolver. John raised a finger, listening. Another step. The crunch of boot on snow. He moved to the window, staying low, and peeked through the side slat. One figure. Then another. Shadows slipping between the trees, careful, cautious. A third stayed farther back, watching. Their coats were dark, their silhouettes unmistakable. They moved like men who'd hunted before. "They found us," John said. Eliza's face paled, but her jaw set. He crossed the room, placed his hand over hers. "If they come inside, you shoot. Don't hesitate. Don't aim to warn. Aim to stop." She nodded once. The fear was there, but so was something stronger now. She wasn't the same woman he'd pulled from the snow. She'd buried her husband, carried a child through death's teeth, and now stood in the doorway of a reckoning. The first knock wasn't polite, just a sharp, solid thud against the frame. John didn't move. A voice followed, rough and casual, like a man asking to borrow sugar. "Don't reckon you want trouble, mister. We just want the girl." John turned slightly toward Eliza. Her eyes didn't waver. He took a slow breath and opened the door. The cold burst in first, followed by two men, guns drawn, shoulders squared. Behind them, a third stood in the snow watching. That one wore the buffalo coat, red stitching. The leader stepped forward, scar down his neck, exactly as Eliza had said. "Well," the scarred man said, grinning, "ain't you the kind type? Warm fire. Pretty guest." John said nothing. He stood in the doorway, hands at his sides, eyes unreadable. Scar chuckled. She took something that wasn't hers. "We're just here to take it back." Inside, Eliza rose slowly from her chair. The revolver was still in her lap, hidden beneath the blanket. "She didn't take anything," John said at last. "She left what you didn't deserve." Scar's grin faded. The man beside him cocked his rifle. "You get one chance," John said. "Leave now." Buffalo Coat laughed from the trees. "That's a real fine bluff, old man." John didn't move. Scar took one step forward. Eliza fired. The shot rang through the cabin, loud and raw. The man with the rifle jerked sideways, collapsed without a sound. Blood bloomed dark across the snow. Scar turned, shouting. John was already moving. He lunged forward, slammed into Scar with his shoulder, knocking him back through the open doorway. They crashed into the snow together, rolling. Scar swung wildly, blade flashing. John caught the arm, twisted hard, and drove his fist into the man's throat. Scar gagged, choking, eyes wide with sudden panic. Buffalo Coat raised his rifle to fire. Eliza stood behind the doorway, now breathing fast, eyes locked on the man in the trees. She pulled the trigger. Click! Misfire! Buffalo Coat aimed. Then John's shot split the air. His revolver, drawn in the chaos, spoke once. Buffalo Coat staggered, then fell backward into the drift, dead before he hit the ground. Scar struggled beneath him, gasping, She wasn't supposed to." John didn't speak. He pressed the barrel of his Colt to the man's chest. Scar opened his mouth to plead, but the shot ended it. Silence followed. A deep, terrible silence, broken only by the softness of wind through the trees. John stood slowly, wiping blood from his brow. Eliza approached, revolver still in hand, pale, but steady. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, barely. "You? Been worse." They stared at the bodies in the snow for a long moment. Then John said, "We'll need to move. Someone will hear the shots." "Where?" she asked. He looked west, toward the ridgeline beyond the trees. "There's a trail that leads down to the river. Cross it. Keep low. We can make Bridger in 3 days." She swallowed. "I can walk." He glanced at her belly. "You sure?" "I'm not breaking now." He believed her. They took what they could, blankets, food, water. The snow had let up, stars beginning to pierce through the thinning clouds. They burned the cabin. Not out of vengeance, but necessity. Fire would cover blood. Smoke would buy them time. By morning they were gone. The days that followed were cruel. The trail wound through hills and valleys, frozen streams, and old timber roads. John kept his rifle ready. Eliza walked when she could, leaned on him when she couldn't. They spoke little. Every breath was saved for the next step. Once they saw riders on the ridge above, 2 figures silhouetted against the sky. John pulled Eliza into a ditch, covered her with a blanket of pine. They didn't move for an hour. When they finally did, the riders were gone. On the second night, the baby kicked hard. Eliza cried, not from pain, but from the shock of it. John knelt beside her, laid his hand on her belly, and for the first time in years, he smiled. They reached Fort Bridger on the 3rd evening, just before dusk. The gate guards barely blinked at the sight of them, wild-eyed, ragged, coated in dust and grit. A nurse came running when she saw Eliza, called her by name, pulled her into an embrace so fierce it undid her composure. Eliza wept against her sister's shoulder. Finally, after all she'd held inside, John stood back, watching. "You'll stay," Eliza said when she turned to him, eyes full of something that might have been hope. "I ain't made for walls," he said. "Never was." She stepped closer. "You saved me. Twice. More than twice." He looked at her, really looked at her. "I didn't save you, Eliza. You saved yourself. I just walked with you a while." She reached for his hand. "Then walk a little further." He hesitated, looked west again toward the mountains, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the urge to disappear. He stayed the night in the barracks, cleaned his gear, sat with the fire, listening to the murmurs of the garrison. He'd forgotten how loud people could be. In the morning, a knock came at his door. Eliza stood there, hair brushed, face brighter. She held a small bundle, brown paper, tied in string. "I saved you something," she said. He took it. Inside was a carved wooden horse, the kind a man might have made for a child. "I found it in the satchel," she said. "Sam carved it. For the baby." He turned it in his hands, the grain smooth beneath his fingers. "She'll know who you are, John. I'll make sure of it." He nodded. That'd be kind. Then he tipped his hat, walked out the gate, and didn't look back. But he didn't walk far. Just to the hill, overlooking the fort, where the snow hadn't yet melted. He sat there, alone, the wooden horse in his hands, the wind brushing through the grass. And for the first time in years, he prayed. Not for forgiveness, not even for peace, just thanks, because he'd carried something through the storm and come out the other side, not unscarred, but whole. Maybe not forever, but for now. And sometimes now is enough. So, what do we take from this tale? That the frontier was cruel? That survival came at a cost? Maybe it's simpler. Maybe it's this. Sometimes a man carries a stranger 12 miles through a snowstorm, not for glory or God, but because it's the right thing to do. Because the weight of another life, for a moment, makes his own worth carrying again. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. And remember, every mile matters when it's walked for someone else. 3 weeks passed. The spring thaw had begun its quiet work, peeling back winter's hold with slow, patient hands. Ice melted into puddles along the rutted roads of Fort Bridger. Sap rose in the pines, birds called again from the ridgelines. But the thaw had not yet reached John Carver. He spent his days helping where he could, chopping wood, hauling water, fixing fences that hadn't survived the snow. Folks asked no questions. They saw the scar above his brow, the rifle that never left his shoulder, and knew better. Still, they nodded when he passed, the way you do to men who've seen too much and stayed standing. Eliza was stronger now. She moved with more surety, her steps no longer guarded by pain. Her sister, Margaret, had a steady home within the garrison, where nurses came and went in starched aprons and practice miles. Eliza slept there at night, sometimes with one hand over her belly, sometimes clutching the wooden horse her husband had carved. She didn't speak of Sam anymore. She didn't have to. His memory clung to her, quiet and enduring, like a well-worn hymn. Every morning, John saw her standing in the garden by the west wall, arms wrapped across her stomach, looking toward the same hills. She always looked like she was waiting for something, or someone, and every morning he told himself not to go to her. On the 23rd day, trouble returned. It arrived not with fanfare or galloping hooves, but in silence, the kind that shifts the air and tells a man who's lived on the edge of death that death has come looking again. 3 riders, dust-caked, lean, and cruel. They rode into Bridger under the pretense of trade, but John watched them from the porch of the supply shed and felt the old instinct clawing at his spine. The lead man wore a hat pulled low, but the red stitching on his gloves was unmistakable. They tied their horses slow. They spoke with forced smiles, but their eyes moved too much, counting doors, exits, weak points. John didn't move, just stepped down off the porch, rifle loose in hand. One of the riders caught the gesture and tensed. The leader turned, locking eyes with John. The grin was practiced. "Well now," he said, "heard tell there was a woman here. Widow, expectin'. Came through with a drifter. Big man. Mean look." John stared. "We're looking to reunite family," the man added. John took a slow step forward. "You her kin?" "No," the man said, tapping his coat. "But we've got business." "I reckon that business ended in the snow," John said. "I put a bullet in one of yours." Another left leaking red. The grin vanished. The man's hand dropped near his belt. "You think this place'll protect her?" he asked. John looked past them, toward the infirmary windows. One curtain moved. "She don't need protection," he said. "She needs peace." You got no idea what she's worth to the man who sent us." John cocked his rifle. The sound was soft, final. "She's worth more than me." The silence that followed held like a drawn bowstring. Then came the movement, fast practiced. The third rider's hand reached for iron, but John was faster. One shot cracked, clean through the man's shoulder. He dropped screaming, rifle clattering in the dust. The second rider spun, drawing his pistol, but too late. John's boot caught his knee mid-turn, toppling him. A quick blow with the rifle stock ended it. The leader was already backing away, hand out, eyes wide. "We can walk away from this," he said. "Ain't nothing here worth dying over." John's finger tensed on the trigger. Then a voice, Eliza's voice, rang out behind him. "No." She walked past the infirmary gate, coat open, dress streaked with drying earth, hair pulled back. She looked small but steady, unmoving. "He's right," she said. "There's nothing here worth dying over. But there's plenty worth living for." The man's lip curled. "You don't know what you're carrying. You don't know who wants it." "I know who you killed," she said. "I know what you tried to take." He stepped forward, desperate now. "You don't understand." John's rifle barked. The bullet hit the ground at the man's feet. He froze, hands up. "You tell whoever sent you," John said, "that she ain't a possession. She ain't leverage. She's a mother. And if they come again, I won't be polite." The man backed to his horse, dragging the wounded one with him. They rode out slow, heads low. John watched until they vanished beyond the ridge. Then he turned, rifle sagging in his grip. Eliza stood there, eyes locked on his. "You knew they'd come," she said. "I figured they might," he said. "Didn't think they'd be dumb enough to try again. They won't be the last." "I know." She took a step closer, then another. "I don't want to run anymore, John." "I know," he said again, softer. "I want to raise this child in a place where no one comes knocking in the night. You will. With you." He looked at her then, not just with worry or wariness, but with something older, deeper. The kind of look a man gives when he's been alone so long, he's forgotten what hope feels like. "You sure about that?" he asked. "I am." He nodded. "Once. I ain't a gentleman," he said, "and I've buried more than I've saved. You saved me." He didn't answer, but when she took his hand, he didn't pull away. The weeks that followed passed without gunfire, without storms, without blood. The garrison posted warnings to neighboring towns. Word spread quick. Eliza Whitlock was under the protection of a man who'd once walked 12 miles through a snowstorm just to keep her breathing. A man who said little, but carried a colt like it was part of him. They started calling him the Bear of Bridger. He hated it, but he stayed. When the baby came, it was in the early hours of a soft morning. Rain tapped on the windows. John sat outside the infirmary, pacing, boots worn near through. He heard the cry. First the baby's, then Eliza's laugh. Margaret opened the door a few minutes later. "She wants you." He entered slow. The room smelled of lavender and boiled linens. Eliza lay propped up, pale but glowing, a bundle wrapped against her chest. "She's here," she whispered, "and she's strong." He crossed the room, stared down at the baby. Tiny fingers curled around her mother's. "What's her name?" he asked. "I was thinking. Clara." He nodded. "That's a good name." Then she smiled. "Middle name's yours." He looked up startled. She raised her eyebrows. "Unless you'd rather I didn't." He shook his head. Something caught in his throat. "Eliza," he said. She reached for his hand again. "You carried me through the snow, John. Through death. Through fire. Let me carry your name." He sat beside her and took the child gently in his arms. "Clara Carver." She blinked once, yawned, and nestled into the crook of his elbow like she'd been waiting for it her whole life. And just like that, he found it. Not redemption. Not peace. Something simpler. A reason. The man who had walked 12 miles without a word, who had buried his family and his voice in the same grave, now sat with a newborn in his arms and a woman who would not let him vanish again. Outside, the west still turned rough and restless. There would be more storms, more men with guns. But for now, within these walls was something strong, something sacred, and sometimes, in a land carved by grief and grit, That was enough to start again.